Welcome to today's episode of the Normalize Surrogacy podcast by Surrogacy Mentor. I'm your host, Carey Flamer-Powell, experienced gestational surrogate, surrogacy agency founder, and owner of Surrogacy Mentor and Modern Parent Mentor, where our aim is a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey for all. Today, I'm joined by our special guest, surrogacy agency owner and Seeds board member, Lisa Hughes. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Carey. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So I'm excited about today's topic. It's possibly somewhat controversial, but we're talking about religion and surrogacy and all the ways that it interweaves into surrogacy that maybe people don't think about, and maybe ways that people think about a lot. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this. And before we do so, I do want to share a little bit of biographical information about you. So Lisa Hughes is the owner of GS Moms, which is a surrogacy agency, and she is also a two-time surrogate. She's the mother to 6 children and 2 grandchildren. Lisa is also a board member of Seeds and chair of the education committee, but most people know her as the host of the Seeds Brown Bags. Lisa has been working on a variety of committees and boards and working with nonprofits since she was 12. From school boards to the Battered Women's Association and the founding board member of a natural foods co-op, Lisa has helped a variety of people throughout her life. Her passion is helping others, and she enjoys making a difference. So welcome, Lisa, again, and so happy to chat with you. I know you and I haven't had a chance to talk on one of these podcasts, so I'm excited to get your perspective on this topic.
It's a fun, edgy topic.
It really is, right? All right, so let's start out. You and I kind of, had a little small powwow ahead of time about what we wanted to bring into this conversation. There have been some big developments as of the airing date of this podcast with regard to things that affect surrogacy greatly that have a lot of religion in them. So we'll get to those in a sec, but why don't we start with sort of the overall idea of the history of surrogacy in religion?
So the first places that at least I know of where surrogacy is mentioned is actually in the Old Testament in Genesis. So you have the story, everyone's familiar with the story of Abraham and Sarah and how they, didn't have children. They were getting older, but Abraham had this promise that he was going to have, all of these children. And so he's going to be the father of, as many as the sands of the sea or something like that. So she gave her handmaid to Abraham so that they could have a child. So that would obviously be what we would consider now traditional surrogacy. IVF hadn't been developed yet. So, that's what they were left with. But it was accepted. And the child born through surrogacy was accepted as her child and Abraham's child. Of course, later she did end up having another child, Isaac. And so, there were 2 children. Now, some people look at that jealousy as like, see, this surrogacy is a bad thing. Like that's caused, all of the wars in the Middle East is some people will go to that extreme. But they forget that there are actually other instances of surrogacy in the Bible. So also in the Old Testament, there is Jacob and Rachel. So Jacob and Rachel also had a hard time conceiving, and they used 2 different surrogates actually to have 2 children. And again, both of those sons were accepted as Rachel's children, as Jacob's children. They're the foundation of parts of the 12 tribes of Israel. So there wasn't any question there. Like it's not until later that I think religion has actually started to make an issue of it on a variety of different levels. But the nice thing is that the Old Testament is actually the one part where a lot of different religions converge, right? So the Jewish religion believes in the Old Testament. The Muslims believe in the Old Testament. Obviously, Christian, any of the Christian denominations believe in the Old Testament. So it's kind of where everyone kind of comes together, but they have different views on it. So it's fascinating. And then you you look at even the same religions, but in different parts of the world also have different views on it. So anyway, it's just fascinating to me, but it's, as far as we know, this has been going on for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you brought up the other religions, because I want to make sure that people understand when we talk about religion, even though we live in the USA and the predominant religion is Christianity, we're not just talking about Christianity, we're talking about all different kinds of religions, and how, first of all, how those religions speak about surrogacy in their history, how they speak about surrogacy now, and most important, I think, to a lot of people listening, how do religious views affect the decisions and the process for surrogates and intended parents today in surrogacy? So before we move on to that, let's talk a little bit about what you know about some of the other religions besides Christianity and how they view surrogacy today.
Sure. So, the Jewish religion, both you and I have worked with parents from Israel. Um, and so there's actually been some shifts, I'll say, that we've seen throughout the years. So I know back when I first started, the surrogate had to be single and Jewish through her mother's line. And when we say Jewish through her mother's line, like documented, like the lineage had to be documented and signed off by a rabbi, like a certain level of rabbi. Um, and then the parents, of course, were Jewish. They had to contribute, or they had to find, if they needed an egg donor, the egg donor also had to be Jewish on her mother's side, because in the Jewish religion, your Jewishness comes through the line of the mother. And so here we have all of these different, who is the mother, like, questions. And so they just covered all of the bases, right? So the intended mother was Jewish, the egg donor was Jewish, the surrogate was also Jewish, and the surrogate needed to be single, because not that like she was married to the husband, because she wasn't, but she needed to be single in order for that child to not be her husband's.
Right, right.
Is the best way I can kind of explain it. We did actually have one case where we had a married Jewish surrogate, but her husband was not born Jewish, and so the Jewish religion did not acknowledge that marriage, and so therefore that was okay. So
Got it.
it can get very interesting. And now they've kind of moved to like pick one. Like just one needs to be Jewish and we're okay. So like if you can find a Jewish egg donor, that works. If you can find a Jewish surrogate, that works. Like they're trying to make it more accessible, and they're less hung up on, I guess, like everything needs to be just like this. So that's a Jewish religion. Then in the Muslim religion, and this one's fascinating to me because they're different views, even though it's the same religion, they have different views in different parts of the world.
Right.
So um, in Uganda, I spoke with the Mufti, who's the head of the Muslim religion there in Uganda. Um, and his feeling was that it was very much like a wet nurse. So in their religion, they have rules about wet nurses. So wet nurse is allowed, you pay her, but the children of the wet nurse cannot marry the children of the family that she nursed, if that makes sense. Because
Sure.
they consider them to be, well, now you're like family. So
Got it.
like almost like siblings, so you shouldn't marry each other. And he felt that surrogacy was very much like that. It's still a woman caring, for someone else's child. And so their biggest concern with surrogacy was to make sure that the children of the surrogate did not marry the children of the family that she cared for.
Okay.
That was the biggest concern, but they were totally on board with it. In fact, they felt that it solved the issue of jealousy between wives, because there they allow polygamy. And so and they said the biggest reason that a man will take on a second wife is if the first wife is infertile. And then it can cause contention, which is also what you see with Jacob and Rachel and Leah, right? Because Leah was able to have children and Rachel really wanted children. And anyway, there's a lot of feelings there, and it's a very deep seated desire to have a family. So he felt that it solved a problem, right?
Mhm.
Surrogacy solved a problem in that area, but allowed people to have families. So,
Right.
and then in Christian religions, of course, there's a whole lot of different feelings depending on which way you go. From
Yeah.
one extreme, which is like the Catholic view, which is any intervention in family building at all is wrong, from birth
Mhm.
control to anything,
Mhm.
IVF, anything.
Right.
Um, that if you're supposed to get pregnant, you'll get pregnant.
Right.
That's one extreme.
Mhm.
All the way to other Christian religions that see it more as like an act of service,
Mhm.
and helping people is good, and surrogacy is fine. So, and
Right.
everything in between.
Yes.
So, and I'm sure there are other
Right.
religions out there, but
Yeah.
those are the ones that have I'm familiar with.
Sure. And those are the ones, with the exception of maybe Muslim, those are the ones that seem to be the most involved in today's surrogacy, than news headlines or intended parents coming from certain cultures. It seems like those are the main ones. So that kind of ties perfectly into sort of the next topic that I want to broach with this overreaching topic of religion and surrogacy. So we've had a couple of big developments in the last couple of months with regard to um, surrogacy and religion sort of poking its nose into surrogacy, if you will. Um, so let's talk about the most recent one. I think that makes the most sense. So let's talk about, for those that haven't heard, the Alabama Supreme Court made a ruling about a case where some intended parents sued a fertility clinic or a storage facility, was it?
It was a hospital that had an IVF, fertility clinic, like as a part of the hospital.
Right. And they sued them because some embryos were damaged. And so the result of this case is that the Alabama Supreme Court said, to put it very simply, embryos are children and they must be given the same rights and held in the same legal regard as children. So let's talk about, first of all, how did religion affect this ruling? I know a few things about the ruling, having read some of it. And I know that the word God and I believe Jesus are in the actual opinions written in support of this ruling.
Yeah, there's several quotes from the Bible in the ruling. Um, there's also a lot of incorrect medical terms. Like they'll say that this happens at this stage when like that's not the stage that happens. Um, so it's kind of lacking the scientific or medical facts. It also
Mhm.
makes claims that in New Zealand and Australia, the common practice is to do one embryo, like to only create one embryo at a time, which just so everyone knows is false.
Right.
It's not the standard practice anywhere in the world, because from the practical standpoint, um, the way we explain it to our clients is the law of halves. Now, just remember that these halves are general, like everybody's different, but the number of eggs that you retrieve, it's still considered fairly normal to lose half of them, as far as, half may not develop, half
Mhm.
may not, even make it to 2 or 3 days, half may not
Mhm.
make it through PGS testing, half may not, and it kind of keeps going down from there. Like this gets halved and then this gets at each kind of stage. It can be
Right.
half, half, half. So you can retrieve 20 eggs and end up with three
Mhm.
embryos, and
Mhm.
everyone's like, "Hey, that's good. You've got three." Like
Right.
nobody's
Yeah.
gonna say, "Oh, there's something wrong." And
Sure.
so, I think part of what plays into this narrative between religion and science, for lack of a better word, is also partly this pro-life abortion narrative that we've had going on in this country for a long time,
Mhm.
which is this assumption that every single pregnancy ends in a healthy baby.
Mhm. Yep.
And so, which is just not accurate.
Right.
There's all kinds of medical issues and things that can happen to people that absolutely want this baby, this pregnancy, that
Yeah.
facilitate something else needing to happen. It's
Right.
not going to end up in a healthy baby. But the whole conversation politically here in America, a lot of times is it's either you're protecting the baby or it's my choice.
Right.
For some reason, in the political narrative, we don't have this conversation of nature is a funny thing
Mhm.
and can go a million different ways. And we need to um, allow for the, like, there's no way to make a law that's going to cover every single decision that needs to be made
Mhm.
because there's too many avenues that it can go. So,
Yeah.
the only one really is to leave the choice between the woman and her doctor because
Right.
every situation is unique.
Right.
And we're starting to find that out in Texas.
Mhm.
So maybe that will be heard and come across. But this concept of the sanctity of life, at
Mhm.
least to me, is
Mhm.
actually separate from this conversation about when does life start? Is abortion okay? Any of these things. Because, for example, an ectopic pregnancy, okay, that happens after, conception, after the sperm and the egg have fertilized, because it's
Mhm.
attached to the fallopian tube, typically.
Mhm.
Nobody's going to survive that if there's not medical intervention that's done. The baby's not going to make it, the woman's not going to make it. Um, so to pretend that somehow there's some avenue of, like, if we just protect the life of the baby, this will be okay,
Mhm.
is just not accurate. They
Right.
can't take that embryo and move it to the uterus. Like, there's no scientific technology that allows for that. So
Mhm.
at some point, we need to have that conversation because that's the real conversation and it impacts women's health. And
Right.
to say that, oh, there needs to be a medical board that's convened to sit here and debate this issue while her
Mhm.
life lies in jeopardy just isn't fair. But that's where
Right.
it's coming from. And this is probably more controversial. I believe part of the issue is that a lot of times men are the ones making these decisions and they
Mhm.
don't actually understand how women's bodies work. Like, because even
Mhm.
if you take biology class and, all of these things,
Yeah.
it's different than seeing all the different ways that a woman's body works and how everyone's a little different and every situation is different. And you can't just say it's like this always, because in
Sure.
reality, it's just not like this always.
Right.
And so we kind of have this competing, like the two of these are meeting together.
Mhm.
Um, and we're ending up having to rely on, in this case, a Supreme Court judge who was a man. And so he went back to the Bible instead of medical science and made his decision. And they also don't look at the repercussions of that decision. Like, they think
Right.
it's very isolated and it's just not.
Right.
So
And sorry, and that's what I
no,
want to focus on, which is how did this affect surrogacy and IVF, and as a result, surrogacy, particularly in Alabama, but now also in other states. I have seen some of the fallout, and Seeds issued an official statement, as did ASRM, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, as did
was all
Resolve, which is
mhm.
the National Infertility Advocacy Organization for fertility and infertility rights. So all of the major players have come out and said, oh my gosh, this is catastrophically wronged and catastrophically limiting for people specifically in Alabama, but now other states as well that already had sort of tenuous fertility rights. So let's talk about what has happened in Alabama since this ruling came out.
So there are 5 IVF clinics in Alabama.
Mhm.
3 of those 5 or 2 of those 5. Okay.
Three.
Okay, 3 of those 5 have halted IVF altogether. They're
Yeah.
just not doing it. They're also not allowing, well, it's not that they're not allowing. So you also can't ship your embryos out of Alabama because now any transportation company, the liability is they could be up for murder. And
Mhm.
of course, embryos are known for, like, if you're running the risk on that, like,
Mhm.
chances are there's some, embryo that's not going to make it. Like, that's just
Right.
how it works. So, and then the
So let
other,
me just clarify that for people that are listening. The Alabama ruling said that an embryo is a child. It's not an embryo, it's a child. So therefore, you can't freeze it, you can't transport it and lose it, you can't donate it to medical science, you can't in any way result in that embryo dying or not making it or being disposed of, because that is now a child with the rights of a child. So embryos that would normally be able to be kept frozen and shipped to another clinic so that the parent could continue their IVF cycle or their surrogacy, now the transportation companies are like, heck no, we're not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole, because if one of those embryos is damaged or doesn't make it through the transportation process, we are now possibly held liable for murder of a child
correct,
/ embryo.
correct. And also, it doesn't only impact just freezing, because now whenever you create embryos, there are always some that don't make it. That's why
Right.
the IVF just period has stopped.
Right.
Because even creating embryos now is an issue, because
Right.
just the natural process of creating embryos, that there are some that will not make it. And how are you supposed to prove, not prove, especially with a court that obviously didn't even pass biology class?
Right.
How are you supposed to prove to them that this may or may not have survived anyway, or would, chances are wouldn't have survived? Like, there's no way to prove that, because you don't always know. Like, a lot of times you're just like, well, we'll give it the best shot.
Mhm.
So it's very complicated. Some people have been talking about, well, is that kidnapping? Is that holding my child hostage because I can't come
Mhm.
and get that child? I mean, it
Mhm.
really, the only option that I can see, and I could be totally wrong, and I'm not an attorney, would be for parents to physically go themselves to another IVF clinic, rent a cryo tank from that clinic out of state, go to Alabama, pick up their own embryos, right? Sign whatever kind of waivers needed, and then transport them themselves
Mhm.
to the new clinic, because
Mhm.
then the liability is then on the parents. But as we also recently saw in a different case, and I can't remember the state that it was in, where a woman had a miscarriage at home, and then she was brought up on charges of mishandling a body or something, because um, she had contacted the hospital. She had contacted a variety of people to ask what to do. And she was early, like, she was pretty early on in this miscarriage. We're not talking like it was a full, baby or anything like that. We're talking like a little, glob of cells. And so she ended up flushing it down the toilet, because it's the only thing that she could think of to do. And she didn't feel okay putting her, in the garbage or anything.
Mhm.
And she was brought up on charges. Now those ended up getting, I don't know, dropped. I was gonna
Mhm.
say waived, but dropped, because it was ridiculous. But
Mhm.
that's the risk that people, there's really nothing you can do now at this point
Right.
with those
And
embryos. They're
so,
just stuck there.
right. And so the fallout has affected obviously people in Alabama who were going to or were in the middle of starting IVF or creating embryos or surrogacy. That's completely stopped. And the people that are trying to get their embryos to another clinic are potentially stuck and stopped. So it's obviously been catastrophic in that sense. There's other states like Texas, I believe
Texas,
Florida is one of them. What's the other one?
Arkansas, I think there's Missouri,
Yeah.
and I mean there's 14 different personhood bills of a variety of, like, they're all attacking different issues. So, like, one's about, when does child support start? Like, there's different
Right.
things like that, but they're all basically personhood bills. The biggest concern I've heard is about Texas, because of course we know about their abortion rules and all of the difficulties that they've been having there.
Right.
But they have been saying, since there was no carve out for IVF, and what they had been saying was, well, IVF it was never our intention to target or stop IVF. So it's not a problem. So there's a
Right.
lot of states that have these personhood bills or these abortion bills that are severely limiting. And now, because there's no specific carve out for IVF, which everyone had said when they were doing these bills, oh, don't worry, we aren't, that was not our intention. This doesn't apply there. This now shows that it applies. And
Right.
so that's the problem, is no one's really sure exactly what's going to happen. And it's only been, a few days. It hasn't been that long
Mhm.
yet. So I'm sure there will be more fallout to come.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's not just your ability to build a family now that's at risk, but
Mhm.
it's your health while you or your surrogate or anyone else is pregnant.
Yep.
It's, the liability of even just regular people that just get pregnant in the normal fashion. At what point, like if you have a miscarriage, like should you even try to get pregnant if you are, let's say, older or have a history of miscarriage? Should you even try to get pregnant if you're now going to be at risk of a wrongful death suit because someone's going to try and prove that you did or did not do something that maybe you should have or shouldn't have done? And we've
Right.
all, I mean, if you've ever been pregnant, all the advice that you get from everyone, right? This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do.
Mhm.
That doesn't stop or change when it's trying to get pregnant. There's the same
Mhm.
type of thing as far as
Mhm.
advice, and everyone has a different belief of what they should do or shouldn't do. There's tons of misinformation, old wives' tales, things like that. Um,
Mhm.
and you just don't know. I mean, it's a
Right.
very passionate topic. Your
Mhm.
ability to have a family, your ability to, carry that pregnancy, like all of those things are very, very just innately a part of being human.
Mhm.
And people are trying to attack each other about, whether or not they think that you should or should not do what, you know, have a family.
Right. And that's really what it boils down to, which is that at the end of the day, religion has greatly affected the rights of individuals to make their own decisions, whether it's medical or family building related. And now we're starting to see Supreme Courts in different states make way for other legal arguments in other states to step in and say, see, this is what this court said, so now we want to say this too. And what that is ultimately doing is basically making it almost completely impossible for citizens in that state to build their families or safely make medical decisions for their own health. And so it can't be understated, in my opinion, that this Alabama decision has already started to have a ripple effect that is completely detrimental to people being able to pursue IVF, surrogacy, and like you said, maybe just pregnancy in general. And that should be concerning to anyone, regardless of religion. It should be concerning to anyone that cares about being able to make their own choices about their own health and their own family, period. And that's really what we're talking about and why everyone is so concerned, right?
It's true. Because when you take a case to court, a lot of what they're relying on is called legal precedent, which means decisions
Mhm.
made, right, by this court or that court. Now, the good news is that for decades, there have been legal decisions made that say, no, this doesn't count. No, an
Mhm.
embryo isn't a child. No, you can't start child support till this. There's a lot of those types of decisions,
Mhm.
but we're starting to see this push, right? The
Mhm.
other direction now. And so it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. But as we've seen in several states, like I think it was what, Kansas? Um, they had a personhood bill on their ballot, and
Mhm.
and this is a very conservative state, it overwhelmingly lost.
Right.
People said absolutely not. So
Right.
we're seeing more that it is not a conservative versus a liberal
Mhm.
um, issue. This is a women's health issue, and
Right.
it's women that understand. And while, of course, there are always outliers, and there are women that haven't had issues with their fertility, they have a very specific experience. And so they have a hard time understanding other experiences where your journey to parenthood has been more difficult. Um,
Mhm.
but it's very, very important that women speak up during this time,
Mhm.
because otherwise we're letting these men make the decisions for us. And I'm sorry, they just don't understand how it all works. They just don't.
Right, they don't. And I would say definitely true of the men making the decisions, but also just the government in general making decisions, which is a lot of the reasons why SEEDS is really important, the Society for Ethics in Egg Donation and Surrogacy, of which you're a board member and I'm an officer, and we're both longtime members. Because if we, as a surrogacy, fertility, IVF community, fertility community, don't come together and try to educate and set standards and set forth some form of self-regulation and understanding of how things should work and how presenting facts, then we have people like the Alabama Supreme Court judge who know nothing about surrogacy, nothing about IVF, nothing about, it seems, general biology, and are making big decisions that make massively impactful, um, catastrophic results on people. So it's important that we as a community come together and factually state, like, this is really what the deal is. This is how it's affecting people in real life today. And this is why this should not be upheld and should not be the case. The good news is that the Attorney General in Alabama has, at least for now, said they will not prosecute anybody for anything related to this decision. Whether that changes or not, we'll see. But I think that just people being aware and doing a little more research into it is important, so that they understand what's going on in our country today,
Well,
as
and the
well
nice
as, go ahead.
and the
Yeah.
nice thing about Seeds is that unlike some of the other organizations, we have a wide variety of professionals.
Mhm.
So it's not just patients, it's not just doctors, right?
Right.
We have doctors and mental health professionals and attorneys and
Mhm.
agencies, and we can share all of these patient stories. So it's really kind of a wealth of knowledge. And I hope that at some point, um, some of these legal, I don't know, the people that are put in the place of making some of these decisions will be able to come to Seas to get educated on some of these items before they make some of these huge decisions. That they can get us involved, because it's really a unique organization that can provide that full viewpoint of the impacts of some of these laws. So, and we do have the standards now, which is excellent. So we,
Mhm.
it kind of provides that here's what you should expect if you're a surrogate, if you're a parent. Here are the standards you can expect from your agency, and then we'll be expanding that out as well. So hopefully, we can get that education out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're kind of running out of time, but I do want to tie this back into, um, religion as a whole. We can see the damage that it can do in surrogacy, but in terms of how it affects the decisions and the process of surrogates and intended parents, the number one thing that comes to my mind is I've definitely noticed a lot more surrogates coming through who say that they will not terminate a pregnancy, and what we call no termination surrogates, who basically say, I don't believe in termination, whether it's for myself or as a surrogate, and I only want to match with parents who have the same views. Definitely seen an uptick in that. Um, so, and a lot of them do also say that they are, because they subscribe to a specific religion, and that that's the religious views that motivate them to say no termination regardless. So, how do you feel like religion ties into surrogacy today, and then the balance between surrogates making their own decisions based on their personal and possibly religious beliefs versus the rights of parents to make decisions for their own child?
So, first of all, I believe that everybody has the right to make their own decisions about their own body.
Mhm.
So, if a surrogate feels that they will never, under any circumstance, terminate, that's absolutely okay.
Mhm.
And it is also important that they match with parents with the same view.
Yeah.
That said, um, surrogates, by just the nature of qualifying to be a surrogate, you have not had any fertility issues. You've
Mhm.
also not had any complications
Mhm.
during your pregnancy. And so we tend to also educate about things like an ectopic pregnancy. Like,
Mhm.
is that really something that you could, take a pill basically that would stop the hormones that could then save your life so that your children, will still have you as a mother?
Mhm.
Is that really a hill that you want to die on? Um,
Literally.
literally, yeah, because
Mhm.
that is what will happen.
Right.
Um, or, what if your blood pressure gets too high? They're trying to, control it with medication, but it gets to a point where the only way to save your life is to deliver that baby, whether the baby is going to make it or not.
Right.
And when you're in that 20-ish something week, you don't know. You don't
Right.
know what's going to happen. So, I mean, even at 30 weeks, you still don't know, but at least it's better.
Mhm.
Um, and so we have those conversations. It's like, it's fine that that's your discussion, that is your thought process. It is your
Mhm.
body.
Mhm.
But let's go through some of these scenarios just to
Mhm.
make sure that you have thought these through, that that's an
Yeah.
educated decision and that that's still something that you are wanting to um, stand firm on.
Right.
Because I'll be honest, I had a no term case where the intended parents were no term. The surrogate was no term. So they were
Mhm.
absolutely on board with this.
Mhm.
At the 20-week ultrasound, they found that the baby was missing a lot of its internal organs. So
Mhm.
it was missing its esophagus, it was
Mhm.
missing its urinary tract. So basically, for those that don't know, the baby kind of works like a pump
Mhm.
inside of the womb. So
Mhm.
it swallows in the amniotic fluid, it goes through their body, it pees it out. That keeps the fluid levels um,
Mhm.
kind of steady, right?
Yeah.
So this baby was missing a whole bunch of its internal organs, and the doctor said, we do not have the medical capability of fixing this. Like if it was something like a hole in the heart or something, like
Yeah.
we could do this, but we just don't know what to do. So they went
Mhm.
to, you know, second opinion, third opinion, like I mean, they had another ultrasound done by somebody else almost every other day,
Right.
and they were watching the baby decline.
Mhm.
And so finally, I forget if it was the surrogate or the intended parents, but one of them asked the doctor at one of these appointments, is the baby suffering?
Mhm.
And they said, well, basically, it's like starving to death and suffocating at the same time. And we're just not sure which is going to get the baby first. Like it's not going to make it to delivery. It's
Mhm.
not. We know that. Um,
Mhm.
you know, and so we connected them. I mean, actually, we connected them at the very beginning with mental health, and they were,
Yeah.
working through all of this with a whole team of, medical experts and mental health professionals and everything. And finally, it came down to where the parents said, after they felt that the baby might be suffering, they
Mhm.
said to the surrogate, we're okay if you want to terminate.
Mhm.
Um, but we're also okay and we'll support you if you choose not to. Like,
Mhm.
it's really up to you. Um,
Mhm.
and the surrogate took, I think, like 3 days to think about it. And then she finally decided that termination was best, that she felt the baby
Mhm.
was suffering. There was no way it was going to make it to delivery. Um,
Mhm.
and so they moved forward with that. And all, just so everyone knows, when we call it a termination, all they did was induce delivery. Like
Yeah.
that was it. They're not doing, there's a lot of horror stories about the things
Mhm.
that happen in cases like that. That all they did was induce delivery.
Right.
So um, so that I think you never know until you're in
Mhm.
that situation,
Right.
really what's going to happen. I think it it ties right into the whole abortion decision, right? Like you can be
Mhm.
very hardcore and firm, but then
Mhm.
when you're presented with here's an actual like factual case, what would you do? Then it
Mhm.
might change. And
Right.
and I think that that's the piece that's missing in a lot of this.
Mhm.
That there. I mean, yes, life insurance policies are put into place. They are, okay,
Mhm.
because things can happen. But
Yeah.
I really think that surrogates need to think through and find out what those instances might look like. And
Mhm.
then they can kind of carve out what they feel comfortable with and what they don't, because
Right.
every pregnancy does not equal a healthy baby. And
Right.
so it's finding that out. Now, that
Right.
said, what most surrogates feel is that it's the intended parent's decision. And so they
Mhm.
kind of separate themselves. And I had very religious surrogates that still felt kind of separated from
Mhm.
that and
Mhm.
felt that it is the intended parent's decision because they're the ones that have to live with the repercussions of that decision. And
Mhm.
all the eternal liability, I guess, would be a good way of saying it,
Mhm.
also rests with the parents because they are allowing them to make that decision. And they purely see themselves more as a vessel that's there to help
Right.
them, but not to make that decision. And
Right.
so, but it's a very personal decision. And I feel
Mhm.
that very strongly that everyone has a right absolutely to whatever they feel is going to work with that for them. And they should be able to make
Mhm.
that decision. So I don't
Mhm.
think it's a matter of trying to convince one way or there's a right or a wrong perspective, but I think making an informed choice is very important because a lot of times when you have never experienced anything other than an easy, healthy pregnancy,
Yeah,
it's hard to think about all of the things that could potentially go wrong.
of course. And a lot of times on the opposite end of that coin, the parents have been through a lot of loss and possibly also a lot of complications if they've been able to get pregnant before. So they're seeing it from a completely different lens of many things that could and have gone wrong for them personally. So the overwhelming point as we kind of wrap up this topic, I feel like we need a part two because there's so much more to delve into with religion and surrogacy. But the overwhelming point for me, as I'm hearing you talk about, religion and how it's very subjective and it's very personal and every situation is different. And even people who are super firm on certain beliefs could end up changing those beliefs based on the situation. What that says to me as this general topic of surrogacy and religion is that religion just on its own is very subjective. Look at how many religions there are in the world and look at how many iterations of those religions there are in different parts of the world and look at how wildly different they are and how different even in the Christian religion how different factions see it. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Religion is very subjective. It is malleable. It changes depending on the person and the area of the country and the world. To take something so, the word that's coming to my mind is volatile and ever changing, and try to impose it on something as scientific and literal as IVF and human development and pregnancy is so anti common sense to me. And it's where we see things like Alabama just completely blow up. When you try to take something so completely subjective and insert it into something so very literal and rooted in science, you are bound to come up with situations where a large swath of people are completely alienated and left without options. And I think that's what people need to remember is that there is a time and a place for religion, and it is not in IVF and family building.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that most of these religions, if not all, believe in free agency,
Mhm.
right? So they believe in free agency. They would not agree to a government that imposes some law that stops them from practicing their religion. But yet, what we're seeing here, in at least when it comes to family building, is that they're trying to impose their religious beliefs on others. And
Right.
I think that that's where the conflict is. In reality, is we either have free agency or you are dictating. Now if you're in the majority, then you're dictating how other people should live their lives, but if you think that that's okay, you have to think of yourself on the other end. So for
Right.
example, if Christianity is the majority religion in America, how would everyone feel if a different religion, pick one, I don't care, a made up one, came in and then said this can no longer happen. this is what you have to do. That's what we're doing to other people. And that's why the founding fathers wanted separation between church and state, was because they all came from like Europe, where they had like a state controlled church, right? So the like the Church of England, the Church of, whatever it was that was in charge at the time, and they had to flee in order to practice their religion. So the reason why we have church and state is very much for a factual, like historical reason, and we have somehow forgotten that.
Yeah.
And it's the majority now, which is exactly what happened in Europe. The majority that's trying to then put their belief system onto, other people because they feel it's right. And they have absolute like right to believe whatever it is they want personally, but to impose their religious beliefs on someone else, that's the problem. And so, the government is there to to keep order, right? To make society that creates a social contract so that, we don't go creating havoc with each other, but not to dictate our personal beliefs. And I think that's where we need to have that conversation more, is to acknowledge that there are other religions, that they're actually stopping others from practicing a religion. And there was a case like that in Texas where they were taking that avenue. And I don't know, I haven't heard anything, maybe it hasn't come up yet. But because there were several religions that the Jewish religion believes that the mother's life comes first. So the anti-abortion law in Texas goes against that and is allowing them to not practice that religion. So I think we need to shift kind of our perspective, just like on the abortion discussion at all, where we tend to say it's pro-choice or it's pro-life, and it's not. That's not the discussion. We just are the wrong narratives, and we need to shift the narrative to the actual talking point so we can come together.
Absolutely. I agree. I couldn't agree more. So I think for people who are looking to get, some more insight on this, there's a statement that Seeds issued on our website, seedsethics.org. We'll link to all of these in this episode. So there's seedsethics.org, resolve.org has a campaign going. I believe it's called Fight for Families. That's gathering supporters for helping to stand up against the Alabama ruling specifically. I would definitely check out that organization to get some more information about how people can get involved and get their voice heard on these issues, because it's important and it's affecting all facets of family building, including surrogacy. So I just really appreciate your time today. And again, I think we might have to talk about a part 2, because there's so much we still need to delve into on this. But thank you very much for this really engaging conversation, Lisa.
Thanks for inviting me, Carey. Talk to you soon.
Absolutely. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Normalize Surrogacy podcast by Surrogacy Mentor. I want to again thank Lisa for joining me today. Be sure to check us out online at surrogacymentor.com. If you're interested in knowing whether surrogacy is right for you, take our easy 2-minute quiz on our website. Also check us out at modernparentmentor.com if you're considering surrogacy as an independent surrogate or intended parent. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast to learn more about gestational surrogacy and how to have a safe, ethical, and enjoyable surrogacy journey. Talk to you next time.